In the late summer of 1943, high above a quiet stretch of the Solomon Sea, a Japanese reconnaissance pilot lifted his aircraft out of morning clouds, unaware that the next 60 minutes would carve his name into one of the strangest survival stories of the Pacific War. He flew alone, as he often did, assigned to long-range scouting missions designed to track American naval movements across the widening arc of the Pacific Front. Beneath him, the ocean lay perfectly still, a sheet of glass broken only by thin ridges of reflected sunlight. His aircraft vibrated gently as the engines settled into a steady, cruising rhythm. The war felt distant in such moments, reduced to engine noise and the faint hiss of wind crossing the canopy. But that illusion dissolved in an instant. Without warning, tracer fire streaked upward from the right, tearing through the wing and sending the aircraft into a violent roll. Flames erupted along the fuselage. Instruments shattered. Metal shrieked under pressure as the plane plunged toward the sea. The pilot fought the controls, but the cockpit filled with smoke, forcing him to open the canopy and throw himself into the wind. He hit the water hard. The aircraft disappeared behind him in a column of spray. He surfaced gasping, but alive. Barely 20 minutes later, as he drifted in the swell, scanning the sky for help or death, a second Japanese plane descended to investigate the crash site. The pilot, drenched and stunned, signaled for rescue. But before the aircraft could reach him, a distant growl of engines grew louder. American fighters appeared over the horizon, then dove, targeting the circling plane. The second aircraft went down in flames. Caught in the crossfire of two separate engagements, the same pilot would find himself once again thrown into the violent chaos of survival, forced into a second fall from the sky, this time with no aircraft beneath him and no certainty that the sea would spare him twice. Within a single hour, he would experience two crashes, two descents, and two violent brushes with death. Emerging from each one battered but breathing, carried forward by instinct, luck, and the quiet desperation that defines so many of the Pacific's forgotten stories. This is the extraordinary account of a man who fell from the sky twice in 60 minutes and lived to tell no one. The morning began like many others for reconnaissance pilots assigned to long-range scouting duty, with a steady engine hum, a rising sun burning away the last shadows of night, and the calm illusion that the sky belonged to whoever reached it first. At this point in the war, the Pacific had stretched itself into a vast battlefield where distances mattered more than borders, and where the first sighting of an enemy formation could determine the fate of entire fleets. For pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, reconnaissance was both essential and thankless. They flew alone or in pairs, covering enormous distances in slow, lightly armed aircraft built for endurance rather than combat. Their job was to observe, record, and return, ideally unseen. But by 1943, the Americans were everywhere. Carrier groups moved with growing confidence. Radar coverage expanded, and fighter patrols swept the skies with increasing frequency. The ocean no longer offered safety. It was an exposed frontier. On this morning, the pilot assigned to the long patrol lifted off from an isolated airstrip carved into the edge of a jungle-covered island. His aircraft, a reconnaissance float plane, glided over calm coastal waters before climbing steadily toward open sea. He had flown dozens of these missions over the past year. Each one followed a similar path: rise to altitude, establish a steady course, chart weather patterns, search for contrails, scan the horizon for silhouettes of ships or aircraft, then report findings before fuel ran low. He began by climbing through a shallow layer of clouds, emerging into the soft, golden light of early day. The air was cool at altitude, and visibility stretched far across the open Pacific. Below him, The water shone like polished metal, cut only by the faintest ripples caused by distant winds. From this height, the pilot could see vast stretches of empty sea, a deceptive emptiness, because American carrier groups could be anywhere beneath that shimmering surface. He steadied the aircraft, adjusted the mixture controls, and maintained a constant cruising speed. The engine responded calmly, a reassuring presence in an otherwise isolating world. This was the strange comfort of reconnaissance flying. The solitude, the space, and the sensation that the war existed somewhere far below. He began his observation sequence, scanning the horizon first to the east, then the south. Small islands appeared as dark smudges on the water, their shorelines softened by mist. No jeeps, no aircraft, no contrails, just the quiet hum of the engine and the rhythmic flicker of sunlight across the canopy. But the silence did not last. A subtle vibration passed through the aircraft. Nothing dramatic, just a faint tremor that hinted at a change in the engine's tone. The pilot made minor adjustments to the throttle and listened carefully. The sound stabilized. It was probably nothing more than a shift in wind resistance. He resumed his scan, marking small notations on his clipboard. Far to the southwest, the edge of a cloud bank rose like a drifting wall. Reconnaissance pilots learned to read such formations carefully. They could conceal storms, or they could conceal aircraft. He watched it for several moments, noting the slow shift in color as the sun climbed. No shadows moved behind it. No glints of metal caught the light. Satisfied, he continued toward the next observation point. Below him, the ocean currents revealed subtle variations, light and dark bands stretching across the sea like brush strokes. He checked his instruments again. Fuel levels were normal. Airspeed steady. Altitude maintained. For a moment, he allowed himself to settle into the quiet flow of the mission. Then something changed. It began as a distant flicker, white, thin, almost invisible. Not a cloud, not glare, a shape, a brief reflection, a line moving fast. The pilot narrowed his eyes behind his goggles. He saw it again, a glint of metal, sunlight striking an approaching aircraft from below. It rose sharply from the cloud layer, angling upward at high speed. Then another appeared behind it, and another. The pilot's stomach tightened. American fighters. They were climbing toward him, emerging in perfect formation, their wings flashing against the pale sea. The pilot reacted instantly, thumb on the throttle, pushing the engine hard, banking to the right in a desperate attempt to escape. But reconnaissance aircraft were not built to outrun fighters. Their advantage was distance, not speed. And on this morning, distance was exactly what the pilot did not have. The American fighters closed rapidly. He saw the first stream of tracers before he even heard the bullets, bright streaks slicing through the air, reaching for the wing. He banked harder, fighting the controls as the aircraft shuddered under the strain. The engine coughed once, then caught again. Metal clanged somewhere behind him as rounds tore through the fuselage. He knew he had seconds, not minutes, to make a decision. The fighters were repositioning for another attack. The wing was damaged. Black smoke trailed from the engine. Flames appeared near the cowling, licking upward in quick bursts. The aircraft had become a burning silhouette against the rising sun. He leveled briefly, searching for the sea below as the cockpit filled with heat and smoke. The world narrowed to the smell of burning fuel, the roar of wind, and the vibrating controls in his hands. He reached for the release on the canopy. It jammed. He struck it again. It opened halfway. The next burst of enemy fire shattered the remaining glass, ripping open the cockpit and sending shards spinning through the air. There was no choice left. He forced himself upward against the airflow. The slipstream tore at his arms and helmet. The nose of the aircraft dipped sharply. Flames curled around the engine and streaked along the left wing. The aircraft was moments from breaking apart. He pushed off. Wind hit him like a physical blow. The burning aircraft dropped past him in a twisting spiral. He tumbled through open air, the ocean rushing toward him in a blur of white and blue. He braced. Impact. The sea swallowed him. He resurfaced seconds later, gasping, water pouring from his helmet. Behind him, a plume of smoke rose from the wreck. The engine hissed as it sank beneath the waves. He had survived the first crash, but the hour had only begun. The impact with the water left the pilot stunned, suspended for a moment between the shock of the fall and the numbing cold of the Pacific. Salt water rushed into his nose and mouth as he kicked instinctively toward the surface, breaking through with a sharp gasp. The sky above him blurred, the edges of his vision tightening as adrenaline flushed through his body. He wiped the water from his goggles and forced himself to focus. The wreckage of his aircraft floated briefly in the distance. Broken pieces of wing, fragments of metal, small patterns of oil spreading across the surface. The engine, still sputtering, hissed loudly before slipping beneath the waves. Within seconds, silence returned, broken only by the rhythmic slap of water against his life vest. He checked himself for injuries. No broken limbs, no deep cuts, just bruises forming beneath soaked clothes. His chest ached from the impact, but he was alive. He scanned the sky again. The American fighters had already moved on, banking in tight formation as they resumed their patrol, disappearing into the direction of the sun. They hadn't bothered to finish him. Reconnaissance pilots posed no threat. A downed aircraft, drifting alone at sea, was nothing but a speck in a battlefield too large to notice. The pilot began steadying his breathing. His training emphasized calm above all else. Panic was the first enemy of survival. With deliberate movements, he removed the heavier parts of his gear, letting them sink. He kept only what was essential: life vest, signal cloth, small emergency ration, flare tube. The ocean rocked him gently beneath the warming sky. He had been down before. Many pilots had, but this time felt different, more isolated, more vulnerable. He was miles from land, far outside typical rescue zones, and his mission path placed him deep within airspace contested by American fighters. He could only hope that a passing Japanese aircraft might spot the smoke column from his crash or the thin ripple of debris still floating nearby. Minutes blended into each other. The pilot drifted slowly with the current, watching the horizon for any sign of movement. Occasionally, he glimpsed shadows of fish beneath the surface, small waves rolling quietly under him. He lifted his head at intervals, scanning every direction in a slow, disciplined pattern. After nearly 20 minutes, he heard an engine. At first it was faint, muffled by distance. A low hum, rising and fading with the wind. He squinted toward the western horizon. A small aircraft approached, its profile unmistakably Japanese. A reconnaissance float plane, similar to the type he had flown, moved cautiously across the sky at moderate altitude. His pulse quickened. "Help!" He waved the signal cloth, raising it high above the water. The pilot of the plane banked slightly, circling to get a better view. It was standard procedure. Downed airmen were sometimes confused with debris or false reflections until seen clearly. At last, the aircraft dipped its wings, an acknowledgement. The Japanese float plane descended, preparing for a potential water landing. The downed pilot steadied himself, preparing for the swell and the approach. The aircraft circled a second time, ensuring the sea surface was calm enough. In those moments, the pilot felt relief washing through him, relief that he might be leaving the endless blue behind. But the sky had other plans. Without warning, a distant roar filled the air, low at first, then rapidly intensifying. The Japanese float plane's pilot reacted immediately, pulling up sharply. The downed pilot followed the sound with his eyes, heart pounding. 3 American fighters swept over the horizon, fast, sharp, climbing out of the sun. The float plane, caught midway through its descent, jerked upward in a frantic attempt to escape. But reconnaissance aircraft lacked the speed and agility of fighters. It became a target before it gained altitude, and the American formation closed in with predatory precision. The first burst of gunfire struck the float plane's wing. Shards of metal sprayed outward. The aircraft rolled violently, its pilot fighting to regain stability. The engine coughed before flames burst along the cowling. The plane began a losing struggle, veering into a shallow, doomed glide. The downed pilot, floating helplessly, watched it unfold. He saw the American fighters peel away, banking gracefully as the damaged float plane descended in a spiraling arc smoke trail behind it, marking the air like ink. The aircraft hit the water with a violent splash, breaking apart on impact. A burst of steam rose as flames met the sea. For a moment, everything stopped. The sky fell silent again. Only the distant crackle of burning fuel drifted across the water. Then he saw movement. A figure, struggling near the flaming wreckage, breaking through debris and pushing toward open water. The pilot of the downed float plane had survived the crash. 2 men now floated in the vast Pacific, each the survivor of a separate fall, each spared by seconds and circumstance, each helpless beneath a sky that had just destroyed 2 aircraft in less than an hour. The surreal symmetry of the moment struck him deeply. He had just witnessed, almost from the same position in the sea, another pilot suffer what he had endured moments earlier. Both men now drifted between debris fields, too far apart to reach each other quickly, but close enough to share the same horizon. They were 2 survivors in a world where survival seemed increasingly rare. The sun rose higher. The water warmed. The sea spread endlessly around them. 1 hour. 2 crashes. And now 2 men faced the long uncertainty of open water, with no aircraft left in the sky. The war had swallowed their planes, but not yet their lives. The sea settled into a slow, rhythmic swell as the minutes stretched into an hour and then longer. The vast Pacific, so still from above, became a living, shifting world for the 2 downed pilots floating far below the empty sky. Each wave rose gently, lifted them for a moment, then lowered them again, as though measuring time and motion rather than minutes. The pilot glanced toward the second survivor, the man from the float plane. The distance between them remained too great to close easily. The current moved unpredictably, tugging each man in slightly different directions. Still, the pilot could see enough to know the other man was alive, clinging to a piece of shattered wing. The debris bobbed beneath him, offering unstable support but enough buoyancy to keep him afloat. The downed reconnaissance pilot turned his face to the sky again. The sun had now climbed higher, casting bright reflections across the surface. Light shimmered in thin lines along the tops of the waves, creating small flashes that made it difficult to judge distance or movement. The glare was harsh. The water, once refreshing, grew warm against his skin, and the isolation pressed more heavily upon him. The war, with all its noise and machinery, had vanished. No aircraft overhead, no rumbling engines, no shadows of ships, just silence. The ocean was too large, too indifferent to notice 2 men floating in its immensity. The sea, in its own indifferent rhythm, erased signs of the crashes 1 wave at a time. Burning fuel thinned into glistening streaks. Debris drifted apart. The smoke columns dissolved into the clear blue. All physical evidence of the 2 falls faded slowly beneath an indifferent sky. The pilot steadied his breathing, a reflex learned long before the war. Conserve energy. Conserve heat. Conserve strength. But his mind, sharpened by adrenaline and shock, refused to rest. He replayed the moments of the attack, the rising American fighters, the violent impact, the spiraling descent, the growing flame along the wing. He could still feel the heat against his face, still see the tracers slicing past his canopy. These images came in flashes, like fragments of a film strip burned at the edges. His thoughts then drifted to the floatplane pilot. That man had begun his approach to save a fellow aviator, only to face the same fate within minutes. There was a strange symmetry in their experiences, as though the Pacific had orchestrated a grim pattern, a pattern where the sky took twice but spared them both. He turned again toward the second survivor. The man now rested his head on the wing fragment, his body rising and falling with the swell. He seemed to be conserving strength as well. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. No words were exchanged. They were too far apart, but in that silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding passed between them. They were no longer pilots. They were castaways. The reconnaissance pilot shifted his position in the water. The life vest held him upright, but the ocean's gentle persistence tugged at his legs, dragging him with its unseen rhythm. He oriented himself with the sun, estimating the time. At least an hour had passed since he fell, possibly more. The floatplane's crash had taken place some 20 minutes after his own. Now, both men drifted together through a world with no edges. Occasionally, seabirds passed overhead, distant white specks circling curiously before continuing on. Their presence offered a small comfort. Birds meant land was somewhere not impossibly distant, though still far beyond sight. He considered whether currents might eventually carry him toward an island, one of the countless small atolls scattered across the region. Many pilots had survived by drifting into lagoons, washing ashore days after being shot down. But many others had simply vanished. The pilot had no illusions. Survival at sea was not a matter of skill alone. It depended on time, chance, and whether anyone happened to be searching. He checked the flare tube strapped to his vest. Only one flare. He would not use it yet. There had been too much activity in the sky, a sign that American patrols dominated this section of airspace. A flare too early could attract the wrong attention. He refastened the strap and steadied himself. As the hours wore on, the sun climbed past its apex. Heat radiated across the water's surface, warming the pilot's face and shoulders. The salt stung his lips. Each wave carried the faint taste of metal and oil, reminders of the machines that had brought him here. And still, the silence held. The world felt suspended. No Indians, no voices, no signals, just the long, slow drift of two men separated by distance, but bound by the same strange fate. The pilot's thoughts wandered to his earlier missions. He remembered the feeling of climbing above clouds in the early hours of dawn, the satisfaction of navigating long routes, the routine yet essential importance of the information he brought home. His job was to see without being seen. Yet today, visibility had brought danger. The moment he rose above the cloud line, he had been exposed, one aircraft alone in the sky. The sun continued its path westward. Shadows shortened, then lengthened again. Small fish darted beneath the surface. The ocean swayed in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, gentle but insistent. Now and then, he scanned the horizon for ships. The distance played tricks on his eyes, transforming waves into imagined silhouettes. But as minutes rolled into hours, no hulls appeared. He closed his eyes briefly to rest, letting the sea cradle him. When he opened them again, the light had shifted. Afternoon was approaching. The second pilot was still alive, but the sea was changing. The swells grew slightly larger. The color of the horizon deepened. The wind shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The long drift would not remain calm forever. The silence was beginning to break. By mid-afternoon, the calm that had settled over the water began to shift. First imperceptibly, then with a confidence that only the Pacific could show. The sky, which had been a pale, unbroken blue all morning, grew heavier along its edges. Thin streaks of cloud gathered far to the east, drifting slowly into wider formations. The air cooled slightly. The pilot noticed the change instantly. The sea rarely altered its mood without warning. He lifted himself slightly out of the water to scan the horizon again. The other survivor, the floatplane pilot, remained afloat, still clinging to his piece of wing, but he too now turned more frequently toward the shifting clouds. Even from a distance, the pilot could sense the man's growing tension. They were powerless against weather. A pilot in the air might outrun a storm, but in the water, one had no such luxury. Weather decided everything. The swell strengthened. Waves that had earlier rolled in gentle, predictable rhythms now began lifting with more force, cresting slightly before dropping the men deeper between them. Each passing wave felt heavier, thicker, as though drawing strength from the approaching change in atmosphere. The pilot steadied himself, adjusting his breathing as the life vest pitched lightly with each rise and fall. His muscles ached from hours of floating. His mouth felt dry despite the surrounding water, and salt gathered on his skin in a thin, gritty film. With each wave, he tasted the metallic remnants of his crashed aircraft. A distant rumble echoed faintly over the horizon. Not thunder, not yet, but the unmistakable agitation of the sky preparing itself. The pilot looked to the east again. The clouds had thickened considerably, their lower edges dark and swollen. These were not storm clouds of the violent tropical sort, but the kind that built themselves gradually, a slow curtain that swallowed light and cast wide shadows across the sea. The pilot knew the danger. Cloud cover meant changing winds. Changing winds meant shifting currents. Shifting currents meant drifting farther from any potential rescue routes. He tightened the strap of his life vest out of habit, though he knew it offered little defense against nature's pull. The sea's surface grew darker as the sun hid behind the growing cloud bank. The heat softened. A cool breeze crossed the water, ruffling the pilot's hair and sending small ripples racing across the swell. He glanced again at the floatplane pilot. The man seemed smaller now, his form rising and falling between steeper waves. They were still too far apart for either to offer real support, but there was a quiet solidarity in their shared struggle against the sea. Two survivors, unknown to each other, yet tied together by the same shrinking hope. Minutes passed. The swell continued to build. Water occasionally splashed into the pilot's face, and he wiped it away, blinking to keep his vision clear. He shifted position to conserve energy, allowing his legs to rest while his arms kept him balanced in the rolling sea. Each movement had to be measured, efficient, and calm. Fatigue, not fear, was the most dangerous enemy now. The wind picked up again, not strong but persistent. The pilot felt it against his cheek. The sky above him darkened further. For a moment, the sea grew very quiet, not in sound but in behavior. The waves slowed. The air tightened. It was the eerie pause before the next change. The pilot had felt this sensation before, right before sudden wind shifts or squalls. He braced himself. A strong gust swept across the water, carrying with it a faint spray of mist. The surface around him shivered in countless small ripples. The swell rose again, higher this time, lifting him up before lowering him sharply. Another gust followed, then another. The sea had decided to move. The current, which had previously drifted gently westward, now turned sharply to the south. The pilot felt it immediately. The water pulled at his legs, tugging him sideways. He tried to compensate, angling his body to offer less resistance. But the current's direction grew stronger. The floatplane pilot drifted in the opposite direction, caught by a slightly different pull of water. Within minutes, the distance between them widened noticeably. What had once been a manageable distance, a few long swimming strokes, became a widening gap shaped by forces neither man could control. The wind continued to build, driving small waves into white-tipped crests. The pilot ducked his head as spray struck him. He blinked salt from his eyes. The glare of earlier hours faded, replaced by a gray tone that settled over the sea. Shadows deepened. The horizon blurred. He checked the sky again. No aircraft, no silhouettes, no hope of immediate rescue. A loud crack echoed in the distance, distant thunder finally announcing itself. The clouds overhead thickened into broader layers. The sea began swallowing distance faster now. The pilot could no longer see details in the floatplane survivor's form, only the faint outline of a man rising and falling between waves. He called out once, though he knew the wind erased the sound instantly. The ocean, vast and indifferent, continued pulling them apart, and the day, once bright and calm, had entered a restless phase. Twice in 1 hour the sky had tried to kill him. Now the sea had taken its turn. The next hours would decide whether it would try harder. As the afternoon waned, the Pacific shifted into a darker, heavier rhythm. The air thickened with moisture, carrying the metallic scent of distant rain. The downed pilot felt the change in every movement. The water's pull growing stronger, the waves rising higher, the sky settling into a dim gray. Survival, once a matter of endurance and calm, began turning into a battle against the elements themselves. He lifted himself slightly with each swell, trying to maintain visibility over the growing waves. The second pilot, his silent companion in misfortune, had now drifted so far that he was reduced to a faint silhouette, occasionally visible atop the rising water, then lost behind a crest. The distance between them had become too great to bridge. They were each alone now, carried by separate strands of current. The pilot knew the sea would only get colder as the sun dipped lower. The first touch of evening reached across the water, turning the sky into layered shades of gray and violet. The heat of the day drained from the air, leaving a coolness that settled over his skin. He tightened his life vest straps again and lowered his chin, conserving energy. He had to remain calm. Panic wasted strength. He counted the waves as they passed, steady, repetitive, grounding. 1, 2, 3. During flight training, instructors emphasized routine as a tool against fear. The rhythm of numbers helped settle his breathing and kept his mind focused. But the sea did not care about rhythm. It changed without warning. A larger wave rose before him, taller than the rest, its crest sharp under the fading light. It lifted him higher than before, then dropped him abruptly into a trough that seemed deeper than expected. His stomach lurched. Salt water splashed into his face, stinging his eyes. The swell behind it followed quickly, and he braced as it broke partially over him. He coughed once, wiping his face. The ocean was gaining momentum. The wind shifted again, now blowing steadily from the east. The clouds thickened overhead, forming one continuous sheet that sealed off the sky. The light dimmed rapidly. In the distance, he thought he saw brief flickers, small flashes of lightning playing within the cloud layer, silent from this distance. The pilot knew the danger of nightfall at sea. Darkness brought cold. Cold drained strength. Strength was the line between life and disappearance. He considered using his flare. The tube felt heavy against his vest, a small reminder of the sliver of visibility it could provide. But he hesitated. The sky ahead was empty. The sound of engines was absent. The odds of a Japanese patrol passing overhead were low at this hour, and the approaching storm made visibility unpredictable. A flare wasted now would leave him without a signal if help came later. He chose to wait. As shadows stretched across the sea, the water took on a darker tone, almost black. The last remnants of the day faded behind the wall of clouds. The horizon blurred into nothingness, leaving only the rolling texture of waves illuminated by the dim, diffused light filtering through the cloud cover. The pilot forced himself into a more compact posture, conserving heat. He curled his arms inward, reducing exposure. His legs felt heavy beneath the surface, pushed back and forth by the restless motion of the currents. The salt stung raw patches on his skin, the water cooling more quickly now. He tilted his head back to keep his mouth clear of splashing waves. The world condensed into darkness, movement, and breath. Minutes stretched, then longer still. Time lost meaning in the absence of landmarks, sound, or light. Only the pulse of survival kept him grounded. Occasionally, he glanced toward the direction where the second pilot had drifted, but the shape was gone. Whether distance, waves, or night had swallowed the figure, he could not tell. The sea had a way of erasing without effort. Thunder rolled again, closer this time. A low, heavy vibration that traveled across the water and settled in his chest. He waited for rain, but it did not come yet. The storm gathered its strength like an animal pacing in the dark. The pilot inhaled slowly, mind wavering between exhaustion and alertness. Memories surfaced in scattered images, training flights, long patrols, the faces of fellow aviators who never returned. He wondered if those men had felt this same weight of uncertainty, this same shift from purpose to survival. A new sound broke through, a faint, rhythmic tapping, almost like distant raindrops. But the sky overhead remained dry. He tilted his head slightly, listening. Top, top, top. Not weather, not engines. It was debris hitting the water, a wooden crate drifting nearby, carried by the changing current. More pieces followed, parts of his own wreck or the float planes, drawn together by the gathering pull of the storm. He reached out and grabbed a floating plank, using it for additional buoyancy. It supported part of his weight, relieving the strain on his arms and legs. He tucked it under his left arm, easing some of the pressure on his muscles. Small mercies mattered. The darkness grew deeper. The wind whispered low. The sea continued its steady, unpredictable motion. And then, something he had not expected. A faint light flickered through the clouds. Then another. Not lightning, not reflections. It was the glow of an aircraft beacon, far above, almost lost in the night. He froze. The light moved steadily, not darting or circling. A patrol aircraft, possibly Japanese, performing a long-range sweep. It flew at medium altitude, its silhouette barely visible against the dark sky. The pilot reached for his flare tube, pulse quickening. This was the moment. But he hesitated again. The plane was far, too far. A flare might go unseen. Or worse, misfire. He waited. The plane continued its path, gliding through the low clouds like a distant ghost. He lifted the flare, angling it slightly upward. Still too far. Still no certainty. Then, the plane banked slightly. Its course shifted. It began turning toward his direction. His breath caught. He raised the flare higher. It was now or never. With a sharp motion, he twisted the trigger mechanism. A sudden burst of red light erupted into the sky, carving a bright arc against the dark. The flare hissed upward, trailing sparks, illuminating the waves in a sudden flash of crimson. For a moment, the world stood still. The pilot watched the light rise and fade. Watched the aircraft. Watched the sky. The flare's glow dimmed. Silence returned. The waves rolled. The pilot waited. Then the aircraft dipped its wings. It had seen him. For the first time all day, hope cut through the darkness. He exhaled long, slow, trembling, as the plane began its descent. After surviving 2 crashes, a long drift, and the changing moods of the sea, rescue was finally within reach. The night had one test left, but the sky, after trying twice to claim him, had finally offered a way back. The rescue aircraft descended slowly, circling in widening arcs as it searched for the source of the flare. Its navigation lights cut gentle streaks across the darkening sky, faint glimmers reflected on the churning water below. The pilot, exhausted and barely able to lift his arms, watched the silhouette of the plane approach with a mix of disbelief and fading strength. Another circle, then another. The aircraft lowered altitude, its engines humming steadily through the evening air. For a moment, the downed pilot feared the crew had lost sight of him. The sea rose and fell unpredictably, waves obscuring him one moment and lifting him into view the next. But the plane held its path, adjusting gradually toward his position. The hum of the engine grew louder, clearer, more certain. The storm drifted eastward, pausing its final descent. The shifting winds eased slightly, offering a brief window of calm. A small flare dropped from the aircraft, an identification signal. It glowed briefly on the water before extinguishing. It was confirmation. He had been seen. The rescue plane banked once more, then straightened into a shallow descent toward the swell. The pilot watched it skim the water's surface, its pontoons slicing through the waves in a controlled glide. Spray erupted as it slowed, cutting through the sea with practiced confidence until it settled into the water with a gentle, rocking motion. The rescue crew opened the hatch immediately, scanning the swells for movement. The downed pilot raised one arm. Barely, but it was enough. The sailors launched a small boat, fighting the rising chop as they rowed toward him. The wind tugged at their clothes, waves splashing over the bow, but they pressed forward with disciplined urgency. When they reached him, he could no longer speak. Exhaustion had hollowed out his strength. The moment they gripped his arms, the last reserve of tension left his body, and he allowed himself to be pulled aboard. His world shrank to the wooden floor beneath him, the sound of his own breathing and the distant rumble of thunder receding behind them. As the small boat carried him back to the rescue plane, he saw, out of the corner of his eye, the faint outline of another survivor drifting far beyond the waves. The crew had seen only him. The current had carried the 2 men into separate fates. Survival was never guaranteed equally. He lay still as the plane's crew secured the hatch and prepared for takeoff. The engine roared to life. The aircraft accelerated across the water, rising from the surface in a line of white spray before lifting back into the sky. The ocean, which had held him for hours, shrank back into a distant, darkened expanse. The crashed sites, the debris, the drifting pilot, everything vanished beneath the returning layers of night. Only one man rose back into the sky. In the days that followed, the pilot's survival would be recorded without fanfare. A simple note in a logbook, a brief line in a duty report. No one outside his small unit would ever know the story behind those words. They would never know how he fell from the sky twice in 1 hour. They would never know the strange symmetry of 2 crashes unfolding within sight of each other. They would never know how close he came to simply fading into the Pacific, unrecorded and unseen. But he carried the memory for the rest of his life. The violent downward plunge through smoke, the cold embrace of the sea, the long drift under a restless sky, the moment when hope seemed lost, and the flare that brought a distant aircraft turning toward him. He survived not because the sky spared him, but because he refused to let the sea claim him. And in a war defined by noise, fire, and destruction, his story remained quiet. An unseen chapter of endurance written between waves and clouds, where survival depended not on machines, but on the fragile, stubborn will of a single man determined to rise again. Twice he fell, twice he lived, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.